you all a little bit of a frame about Creative Education Foundation and what it is we do. So the Creative Education Foundation was actually founded in 1954 by Alex Osborne, who is one of the original advertising madmen and who is known as the father of brainstorming. So when Alex retired from advertising, he went back home to his hometown in Buffalo and started the Creative Education Foundation because he deeply believed everybody is creative and can learn to be more creative. And with his partner, Sidney Parnes, who was an academic, they created the creative problem solving process, which has evolved since 1954, which is a good thing. But basically what they did is they taught people how to access their natural creativity through an explicit process that they could apply to complex problems or opportunities. So certainly creative expression and creativity is part of what can inspire a creative process, and we certainly engage in that quite a lot. Improv comedy is a big part of what we do. But what we do is we really teach people a system for applying creativity deliberate creativity to improve their professional lives and their personal lives. So that's what we do. We teach people how to be more creative.
Michael, do you want to go?
You go first, Peter.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Sarah, for including me. I'm a fairly recent arrival to Trinity. I'm in my third year here, and I come from a modern dance background, pretty hardcore. I didn't discover dance, though, until freshman year of college. And I think of it as discovering the thing that combined all of my interests, certainly at that time, and I feel really fortunate that it still seems to. But I guess one of the biggest influences in my professional dancing development was a gentleman named Alwyn Nicolai and his collaborator Murray Lewis. And Nicolai was a pioneer in many respects of modern dance and other areas of performance in this country, but improvisation was a huge element of our training and of the whole approach to not only developing the creative works for the stage, but also just in developing an approach really to living, as we like to think about it. From that lineage, and that has been a big influence of mine, along with lots of interaction with a whole host of different artists throughout my professional artistic career. And I guess I just feel like as I've been thinking about this event, it's like, how do you sum up all of the various interests that we have that are, for which I don't have a lot of explanation or answers. I mean, it's mostly a lot of questions that still keep coming up for me. And I guess that's, maybe where I'll leave it at the moment. But I think of myself as a dancer and a choreographer, and as someone that wants to unpack what there is to know about the role of our physicality in all of the other ways that we come to know and think about and live in the world. And I really think that there remains a lot of untapped resource there.
All right. I'm Michael Grubb, and thank you, Sarah, for organizing this. I'm really excited to talk to everybody and to be with you, Peter and Beth. So as Sarah mentioned, my research interests are really squarely on the role of attention in perception and in understanding our conscious experience. And so there's a really famous quote from William James. He says, "Everyone knows what attention is, and it's the taking possession of the mind of one of several possible things." And this is sort of classic quote, but there's a much less well-known quote by James, which is, my experience is what I agree to attend to. Mm-hmm. And he talks about how attention really does, he sort of, in his chapter, one of the first textbooks in psychology, there's a whole chapter on attention, and he, lays out all of the ways in which attention modulates our experience of the world in really important ways. And I think since, that quote, that embedded in that quote is there's this idea of agreement, that we voluntarily choose the things that we pay attention to, and we seek certain things out over others. And while that is certainly true, there's a whole other aspect of attention that I'm really interested in, which is how the environment itself dictates what we pay attention to. And how things that are, bright, or that stand out, or that are unexpected, really pull our attention in that direction, and that changes the experience that we have in that moment. We sort of have this reflexive allocation of attention to those things. And a lot of my work recently has been trying to understand sort of another form of attentional selection, where the things that we have attended to in the past, the way that we use our attention, comes to bear in the future. And it's sort of, these certain attentional biases develop based on our own attentional histories that are all unique and idiosyncratic. So a lot of my work really tries to sit at the intersection of how do we disentangle all these different kinds of attention, and then collectively, how do they guide and really inform our experience of the world? And I think you can see evidence of this in so many different places, for the importance of attention, right? And the need to protect it in many instances. So I'm really excited to talk more today about that.
Awesome. When we were first emailing about this, and Sarah brought up to me, Michael, your work with attention, it's a different way than I've thought about our work, but it instantly gave me a way of engaging and thinking about what all we do. And I had two thoughts instantly. One of the first ones was thinking about something Joan Hedrick said to me in my first Women's Studies 101 class. And she said, and it's always stuck with me, she said, if you've made them laugh, you've made them listen. And I think there's something really powerful. And I think there's something about attention there, right? So if it's not, it's good humor, right? It's not sarcastic or meant to belittle or demean, but it's humor where you give someone a second to get in on the joke. You've made some kind of real connection. And as you talk about attention, Michael, that feels like there's something in that. And part of what we do with the creative problem solving process, when we teach that to people, it's inquiry driven. So instead of like grappling with a problem by saying, making statements about, well, here's how to solve it, we say, what if, or what are all the ways we might grapple with this? So when we invite people to be creative problem solvers, we ask them questions. And the lovely thing about a question is it gets everybody on the same side of a problem instead of an opposing sides arguing a point. So when it immediately changes the dynamic of the room. And, as you were talking, Peter, about performance and ways that you can express creativity or connection through the body, there's something about being on the same side, or being a witness to an action that's happening that gets everyone in cahoots, if you will, which I think can lead itself to a kind of collective experience, but also maybe collective discovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so rich. When you mention inquiry and I guess the notion of to what degree can we allow the body to ask questions? We often, of course, my context is primarily in a dance environment, but I think that this is something that we could probably, I'm not a developmental expert in any stretch of the imagination, but we observed very young humans, and they're firing on all cylinders in a completely integrated way, where the body is, I would imagine, sort of equal to all of the other modes of absorbing and processing and doing. And then over time, as we move into other ways of looking at and thinking about inquiry, we tend to focus on inquiry as a cognitive process at the expense, I think, of reminding ourselves the degree to which the body is always there to be utilized in a similar, or maybe in dissimilar ways, but in ways that are coordinated with all of the other faculties that we possess. So, I don't know, sometimes in class, I'll be working on trying to get at some notion of letting go of what we might think of as a hard center, a little bit of stiffness, a little bit of too much verticality maybe, and just asking your elbow to lead you into lateral space, or your earlobe to drift like a balloon upward. I mean, and you're just the small immediate cue of attending to a tiny point on the body with some kind of creative task that is really pretty easily actionable, not in the realm of right or wrong, not in the realm of needing to demonstrate, as you say, being able to prove something on one side of the question, but actually just using the prompt as a question of whatever, a question of time, a question of space. What do you find out about space or time or energy through that mechanism, I guess?
When you say that, I think that the invitation for students to explore movement that way gives them permission, which creates space for vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So when they can be vulnerable and safe, then they're able to explore. And I often think a lot about, I've had an 8-year-old child teach a workshop at our conference because kids are so much closer to their creativity and their curiosity, and vulnerability, for better or worse, isn't often something that they consider, right, when they're young enough. So they just kind of launch themselves into the world. And as we get older, we get further away from that creative impulse and that permission to do so. And so I think it is a critical role for those of us who are in positions of authority or who are teachers to create those moments of invitation and permission, because in that moment of vulnerability is exploration and that invitation to be curious again.
And I want to flag something that Beth, you mentioned earlier, this notion of joint attention and shared experience. I think is a really, important point that we, and there's a tremendous amount of developmental work on joint attention. So it was interesting that I think the segue, Peter, you immediately were, bringing up developmental ideas, and that's a really sort of critical aspect of development and cognitive development. But how, again, really the goal is to create that shared experience between people where they get attention to the same inputs, and the ultimate outcome is the same. And then Peter, when you were talking about attention to the body, it was really interesting how I think the places that you picked are, places that we don't often attend to in our own bodies. And something that I find, the example that I almost always use when I talk about the importance of attention and the relationship between attention and consciousness, and how, there are some prominent theories that propose that attention is really, necessary but not sufficient for our conscious experience of things. And the example I always give is, until I will say it, you probably don't feel the shirt on your back right now. Right. And then the second that I say it and you bring your attention to that part of your body, you start to have that conscious experience. And that information was there and available to you moments ago. But because you weren't attending to it, you weren't conscious of it. You didn't have that phenomenal experience of that part of your body. So it's really interesting. I can imagine all of the different places you must take that in movement classes.
It's pretty fun. I won't lie. I mean, it endlessly, with endless possibility, really. I mean, sometimes I think that we, broadly speaking, sort of suffer from a kind of physical illiteracy culturally. And yet as the more I think about it, and because of the way you just phrased that example, it makes me question even that notion of illiteracy. And I don't want to get into semantics too much, but it's like our capacity for directing attention or having attention directed is always there, it seems. And maybe with aging, maybe that changes in different ways. And I don't know all of the ins and outs of that, but the capacity for that just needs to kind of be woken up. And this thing about permission or being granted or invited into a sense of agency to remember that you actually are an instrument that is made up of a symphony of moving parts. And when was the last time you thought about how long it takes you to lift your hand up to your head, or how long you might take to extend the fingers, or change it with some kind of energetic fluctuation? I mean, all of the elements of movement, every movement really in dance anyway, we'd like to think of has a time value, has a space value, has an energy value. And each of those areas are areas to be explored creatively. They also are there to be explored in a more restrictive way or in a strict way. If you're trying to teach a step and you need people to be exactly this way or that way for whatever reason, that veers into often a different kind of process that looks, to me anyway, much more like kind of rote learning, and you're kind of forcing, or not forcing, but you're sort of willing the body, directing the body to do this in this particular way. And that can be effective and useful in some circumstances. I think often it's much too frequently utilized as a strategy in dance specifically, that because it mitigates, it minimizes the sort of creative impulse and the sense of agency of the individual to find their own sense of embodiment inside of the activity. And so that notion of embodiment is a fascinating one for me too. And I wonder if that ever comes up for you, Michael, in your research on attention, like that concept of, what is embodiment? Like, what is it? Like I think of it sometimes as being in coordination, but it's not only that. When I look at two performers and they're both performing the same movement material, one of them is incredibly resonant because of something, and the other one might have a real technical proficiency, but isn't resonant in the same way. And that, of course, might be different. I might read it differently than someone else. It might be, one thing might be more resonant for someone else than for another person. But I don't know, does that notion of embodiment come up at all?
Oh, I mean, there are, I think, a number of different places I could take this. There's a whole, there's a whole field of cognitive science that really is about embodiment, and that really thinks a lot about the importance of us being embodied agents. And we think about how we learn about the world and how we interact and how we perceive, and all of that is rooted in being, embodied creatures. I think in attention specifically, at least in the kinds of things that I study and think about, one of the most fundamental kinds of attention that we have is called spatial attention, how we attend to space. And it's often really, it's spatial relationships relative to us, right? So we may, one of the other things that I guess is a fundamental kind of attention is how we move our attention around the world without moving our eyes. This is called covert spatial attention. I see a couple of people here that have actually taken my seminar in attention. So hopefully this is bringing back some good memories. It's nice to see Mike Czar's name there. But yeah, so covert spatial attention is all about how we attend to different locations in the world relative to our own position and to our own vantage point on that world. And then we can also engage overt attentional systems where we move our eyes to get a better, I mean, the way you can say it, it makes total sense. We move our eyes to sort of get a better look at things. But whenever we move our eyes and we fixate on a new object, what we're doing is we're placing the information that's coming from that part of the visual world into our fovea, into the high resolution part of the retina, where we can get the best detailed information, right? So we're also constantly using our bodies to better attend to the world by either physically moving or moving our eyes, or even moving our mind's eye, right, in these covert shifts of attention. So there's a lot there, I think.
So I'm curious, as you all are chatting about this, one of the things that I'm thinking about, one of the things that we teach in our process is that we so our founder is known for brainstorming, right? And brainstorming gets a little blunt because like if you could just brainstorm and nothing happens from it. But truly the process is, it's a sequence of divergent and convergent thinking. So divergent thinking would be lots and lots of ideas, creative thinking, and convergent thinking would be critical thinking, right? And that both of these things have to happen to be truly creative, but they can't happen at the same time. So the metaphor I use to describe it is if you drive a car, right, you need the gas and the brake, but you use them alternately to make the car go. If you use them at the same time, you'll drop your transmission. It's not good. So in the same thing with the creative process, right? So there are times when you brainstorm and you're loose and you experience, but there's a time at which you have to take the best ideas from that you've cultivated and channel into something actually actionable, right? And the work we do is a lot with folks working in business or in schools and trying to grapple with questions of that. But I'm wondering if there might be an intersection there with, Peter, part of what you were talking about with the different kinds of performers, maybe there is choreography, right? There are steps, there is a convergent kind of defined space, but then there is a je ne sais quoi of a particular artist who may take that, be virtuoso in that interpretation and, live within those steps. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something about that interplay and tension between, these are the rules and what can you bring to those rules? And I think that great thinking and the arts, they play in that arena.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder this idea of like the goal and the let me use this word, intention, mm-hmm. and attention. Like those two are also interesting in relationship to one another. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're in some ways they also translate in my body mind into notions of mechanics and aesthetics, mm-hmm. and where there's intersection in those places, and that in most of us, we often at any given moment might be a little bit on one side of that equation than the other. We might want to approach something with a little bit more of a technical approach at certain times, and yet ultimately we want enough of an aesthetic approach in there also so that the thing really resonates and sings and sort of floats above just the nuts and bolts of it. But how to I guess have the presence of mind to be able to shift if you're falling too far in one direction or another. And I'm a number of years ago, I was listening to a podcast, an interview with Ellen Langer, where it kind of stopped me short, where she said something to the effect of, at any given moment, you're either being mindful or mindless. Hmm. And in some ways, I like to think, and what was interesting to me is that she wasn't implying or trying to suggest that one is always inherently better than the other, but it just is sort of a reality that there are moments where we are able to, or we have the presence of mind and focus and body to attend to the thing that's unfolding in this moment. Like, I'm suddenly now paying attention to the way my fingers are moving, where a moment ago I wasn't really. Mm-hmm. And so that notion of mindfulness or mindlessness to me relates to this interesting thing that you brought up, Beth, about action and like the brakes and the gas. It's like you're both receiving information and producing information, and they're in dialogue with one another. And it's not necessarily in dialogue in a binary way. I think it's much more, I think it's much more complex than just two things, and I don't know what else to call them though.
I'm really stuck.
Go ahead, Michael, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on something that you both said. So this notion of convergent and divergent thinking, and then hearing Peter's response to that, it struck me, and I really haven't really thought about this in this way, but the classic dichotomy in visual attention work is between, as I kind of mentioned earlier, between goal-driven attention and stimulus-driven attention, where you're sort of voluntarily attending to the things that you want to attend to, or there's some stimuli out in the world which is capturing your attention. That's sort of the classic dichotomy. But Peter, in hearing you talk, I was really kind of thinking about, that the body itself it can be its own kind of stimulus, right? I mean, I think there's a way that you could be sort of very voluntarily kind of top down, focusing on moving the body in a certain way, as opposed to letting the body be, just basically, I think what you said, being mindful, right? In observing what the body's doing and sort of seeing that as its own, like the body as stimulus, and that the attention in that case is sort of being dictated by what's coming up reflexively within the body in a very stimulus driven way. And they are always kind of going back and forth between these two modes.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, it's one of the things why I feel like I love what I do so much. It's just an endless supply of things to notice, partly because the body is so complex and beautiful in that way, but also because it's changing. My body functions differently than it did 20 years ago, and my awareness of it is different, and my range of motion is a little bit different. And so every day, really, there's opportunity to use the thing that I'm waking up in and going to bed in as a tool for learning and creative exploration.
Yeah, and just to put go back to what Beth really started me thinking on this, with this notion of convergent and divergent thinking, and it reminded me of how I feel when I run at the end of the day, where I spend all day in this sort of top-down mental space. And the reason I love to go running is because I let the thoughts bubble, right? And I feel like maybe that I can imagine in creative work that you must emphasize that you need both of those kinds of mental processes, or you need to sort of spend your time focused and engaged, but also just not do that and let the thoughts come and bubble. And
absolutely. One of my favorite things about when I got introduced to this work was that a staple of our meetings is that we have Legos everywhere and we have things to play with. So, I'll be having like my annual meeting with the board members, and, we're building with Legos while we're talking. And I'm thinking a lot about what you say about attention. We really believe in things like fidget toys, or being able to sit on the floor, or not sitting around a board table, getting up to walk around while you're talking, because we all think in different ways. I often don't know what I think until I say it out loud. I was that kid at Trinity where the professors would say, let's hear from someone else, So I used to actually sit in class with my hand physically over my mouth to keep myself from talking. But like, that was how I thought. So I also take copious notes, which keeps me from talking. But when I was able to play while in a meeting, like I had permission to do that, I found that was a great outlet for me, because it was part of my processing. So I think there's something really, really powerful in that notion of movement and play. I don't run unless something scary is chasing me, Michael, but I'm a rower. So when I need to get out of my head, I get on my rowing machine. And and it's the same thing. Like, I need to kind of just let my mind go and spin and get distracted that way. I think there's very much something there about our physical processing. And when you think about the way that we amputate that, right? And the way that we teach and we learn, where, everyone's going to sit in a row and we're going to sit still for this amount of time, and we're going to follow these rules while we're thinking and creating. How much are we inhibiting different kinds of learners who may be perfectly great thinkers if you let them wander around the room, right? Or you let them look at the wall instead of looking at you, or play with Legos. It doesn't mean that they're not paying attention. It might mean that they process in different ways. So I think that we haven't quite really, we haven't fully tapped the ways that we all process. We are physical creatures, and some of us can sit still and pay attention for a very long time, but some of us don't, and some of us live in our bodies in a different way or process in different ways. And what if we were introduced to that? And again, I felt very liberated to work in an environment where googly eyes and Legos are normal. Like we can play while we're having wildly serious conversations, and that is okay. And I think that's made me a better thinker and a better leader.
Yeah, I think, Beth, that what you said about just untapped potential there, I really think there's so much that we could still understand, that and movement is key to it all. I mean, even just the notion of refining our thinking involves motion, at a very tiny microscopic level, right? But I mean, I think that motion is really at the core of any kind of creativity. Motion maybe being equivalent to change, or that it's essential. If without it, you're not going to get it. I think.
I think it's provocative to think about that, and how much we kind of button up our worlds and our lives, and the structures that we have. And I think, when I think in terms of convergent thinking, having criteria and structure can be very helpful in helping organize thoughts and bring them to action. So I'm not against that. But when we're buttoned up all the time and we have these boundaries all of the time, how much does that restrict what might be created? One of the things that, as you all were talking, I'm a big fan of polarity management and polarity thinking. And the symbol for polarity thinking is basically the infinity symbol, which is kind of uneven. So it's a little bit deeper on the top than it is on the bottom. And the idea is that things don't exist as poles, but rather they move on this kind of infinity loop of highs and lows. So, and I find this really powerful, because it's not like either this or that is better. It's that we exist in this kind of cycle of thinking. So a polarity might be individuality and diplomacy, for example. So if you have lots and lots of diplomacy, it could be good for a while, but if you have too much, you don't get any decisions made. And independence can be great because you can fulfill your own destiny and have an influence. But if you do too much of that, you may alienate other people. So there's highs and lows of each one of those things. And I think that's a really great organic way to think of things. And it's incredibly liberating as well, because we don't get into these kind of dualities of this or that, and this is better or that is better. And a lot of times when we work with schools or other folks, if we find that, what you'll see is this kind of pendulum swing. They're like, oh, we did this and it was too much. And so they go all the way to the other side and like, oh, that doesn't work anymore. So they go all the way to the other side. They're in a polarity, right? And they need to figure out how to manage the ebb and flow of things and recognize that there may be two ways of approaching something, or two kind of poles to an idea that both have their downsides and upsides. And if we manage the upsides and downsides better, maybe that's better. So I think there's a constant interplay. Life isn't an either or, there's an interplay. And I don't think we're particularly well trained to deal with that. And I think it's part of what leads into the incredibly polarized world we have now, where we're not able to negotiate nuance and fluctuation and balance, and understand that kind of movement is actually the normal thing. It's not either or.
So this is just unbelievably fascinating. I'm like so thrilled with all of you. I'm wondering if you're open to taking some questions, if that would be okay. I actually have a quick, maybe not quick, question for Michael. When Peter was talking about sort of developmental influences and then speaking about the fact that his body feels different now than it did 20 years ago, it just made me think about the incredible work that you've done on aging and the brain and risk-taking and decision-making. And I was just wondering if you could maybe say a little bit about that in this context.
Sure. So Yeah, so I did, as part of my postdoc, I did work on decision making across the lifespan, looking at how our preferences for risk change as we get older. So I did a postdoc in neuroeconomics, and it's interesting because really the main motivation for that was I wanted to better understand reward and reward processes in the brain so that I could have a more holistic understanding of attention and sort of the role that reward plays in attention. So I did a lot of this work in trying to understand reward-based processes in the brain. And one of the things that I did this big study as part of my postdoc looking at changes in gray matter volume in a particular part of the parietal cortex, so just up here. And interestingly enough, there's a region in that in the parietal cortex, posterior parietal cortex, that you can measure with MRI, and you can calculate the density of gray matter in this particular region. And in young adults, there were a series of studies showing that the thickness there was related to their risk-taking in the monetary domain. So we use a lot of monetary lotteries to understand risk. And it was interesting because the literature also said that that older adults become more risk averse as they age. And we also know that gray matter thins as we get older. So there was a really interesting and really parsimonious explanation for that. And I did the study to find out if indeed the data show that. And they do. So you can look at changes in gray matter thickness and how they predict risk preferences and account for these age-related changes in risk preferences using those kinds of methods. But there's, that's also another, I think, great thing to keep in mind is that all of the stuff, that we're talking about is itself dynamic. All of these attentional processes are dynamic and change in really interesting ways throughout the human lifespan. Yeah, that's a part of the attention, area that I kind of want to get a little bit more into, thinking about how these attentional patterns change both in different circumstances, but also across the lifespan. I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
I'm so interested to know about how you quantify reward, because I imagine that's a big issue for.
The short answer is we look at monetary lotteries. So you compare different outcomes with different probabilities. So you can modulate the reward level by making it uncertain. And so as you increase uncertainty or decrease uncertainty, you can change the subjective value or the perceived value of different options. And this is really a whole field of behavioral economics that studies how people make decisions for uncertain outcomes, both gains and losses. And then this sort of newish field of neuroeconomics tries to understand the neural processes that go into all of those decisions and how we represent risk and how we represent, reward itself. But yeah, Peter, we should talk more. I'm happy to tell you more.
Yeah. Clearly.
Do other folks have questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or just to go ahead and ask. Well, while you're thinking, can I ask Beth a question?
Yeah.
So one of the things I was fascinated about in your workshop was that it was structured, unstructured.
Yeah.
So like trying to get us to think creatively, but we were literally putting things in boxes. So I was just really curious about whether that was an intentional juxtaposition or and it worked. Like I came up with the greatest solution to my problem. I strongly recommend these workshops.
Yeah, so the creative problem solving process is, I find it really fascinating because it does move between those poles, right? So it replicates kind of structure and safe space within which you can play, right? So, just like any kind of sports field has goal lines, there's a space in which you can play, right? I used to be a professional nanny, and I feel very strongly that children behave better when they know where the boundaries are, right? And that's not necessarily a restrictive thing. They just know where the edge is, right? And they know when they're going to fall off. And when they act like little maniacs, it's usually because they don't know where the edges are. So with creative problem solving, it's expansive thinking. It can be wildly overwhelming. So if you create the arena in which that happens, the creative impulse happens or the freedom happens, there's a modicum of safety, and that allows for the vulnerability to happen. And this is one of the things I love about creative problem solving is you can be like, have no idea about it and take one class and just take one thing away from it, like yes and, which is actually an improv tool, or phrase problems as questions, or just use a Post-it note for one idea. And that's enough to get you started to kind of be able to get some traction on an idea. And again, that idea of the brake and the gas pedal, polarities, things ebbing and flowing, convergent and divergent thinking. We move within kind of this tide of life, and being able to have your buoyancy within that. You need to know where the edges are, and you need to be able to experience the vastlessness of it at the same time, which is complicated. And so what CPS as a process does with the explicit steps provides that kind of life preserver, if you will, so that you're going to float, but you still have that feeling of weightlessness. And the cool thing about it too is as you get more fluent in creative problem solving, you can kind of go deeper and take bigger risks. We have folks that have been practicing creative problem solving consulting, and I call them our Jedi masters. And they're just the way that they're fluent in this is so amazing, and the way they can hold a space is really stunning. But yeah, it's intentional to have some safety. And there's plenty of articles around there like about how brainstorming is complete bunk, and there are a lot of folks who will just do brainstorming, like brainstorm, like all these ideas, and you're just wild and crazy for the sake of being wild and crazy, which can be fun, but not necessarily productive. So that's kind of working without a net in a way. CPS kind of provides that net for great creative thinking that you can do something with.
Anyone else have questions? There's a question about how to get into your workshop, and I will drop the link.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I love about creative problem solving is it can teach you how to create opportunity out of challenges. So when coronavirus hit last year, it meant that we had to not do our live creativity conference, which basically put a 6-figure hole in my 6-figure budget, which was a significant challenge. So my amazing program team created some virtual content. So what we're doing now we have virtual curriculum, and we're doing just fine. So we have been running a class called Being Creative on Purpose. It's the first Wednesday of every month. It's an hour and a half long. That's the class that Sarah attended. It's basically an introduction to creative problem solving in 90 minutes. We do much deeper dives into creative problem solving, but this is a great way to kind of just get introduced to the philosophy. My coworkers, Beth and Missy, I have another Beth. I used to have 3 Beths on my staff. 75% of my staff was named Beth at one point. So Beth and I call it the Beth and Missy show. It's very fun. They're both also applied improv comics, so they're hilarious. But it's a great class. We also run, our big show is the Creative Problem Solving Institute, affectionately known as CPSI. Typically, we run CPSI live. We bring it back to Alex Osborne's hometown of Buffalo for 4 days. But we've converted that into a virtual conference. So CPSI is running this year from June 7th to June 24th. So it's basically three weeks of creativity, innovation, and leadership courses. When you register, you get recordings of all the classes. So like, we don't expect people to actually be available for 3 straight weeks. So if you have to miss something you really wanted to see, you can get the recording of it. But we really pride ourselves that our workshops are highly interactive. And I'm just incredibly impressed with Beth and Missy, my coworkers, for being able to really recreate that in the virtual space. But the CPSI conference in person is incredibly fun. It's exhausting. Being creative like consistently is exhausting, but it's very fun, and really amazing people from all walks of life. So yeah, I can provide, Sarah already put up our website. We got a new website, which I'm super excited about. And there's lots of information there on our programs and workshops, but you should also feel my contact information is also on the website. So please feel free to reach out to me directly.
We have a question from Joan.
Yeah, thank you. You know, you really struck me when you were talking about how people create differently. They can't sit and listen to a lecture for an hour. My older daughter in first grade, her teacher, when we had the parent-teacher conference, said, you know, she works better when she's under the desk. And I don't care.
Yeah.
She's the only teacher that ever recognized that. And she's a very smart girl, but this has been her whole life. I mean, she's now 25. Now she's headed to a new career. And it's the same thing when she's in a Zoom lecture, because she's not staring at the screen, people are like, pay attention. Well, she is paying attention because that's her way of doing things. So my question is, can this be passed on to like teachers? And, you know, like, no, it doesn't work the old fashioned way.
I hope so. So one of my areas of passion is bringing this work to public schools. I'm a first generation student myself. I went back to Trinity College as an IDP student because I failed out of college twice. So there's a whole novel in that if I can ever write it. But so yeah, we learn in different ways, and our very orderly structure isn't inclined to that. And I will tell, and I hope this is reassuring for you, we work with a few public schools in bringing creative problem solving training to the teachers because we trust them to interpret it for the students. Teachers are not against that. And my experience with teachers is they get this, right? They get that students learn in different ways and they want to have more room to do that kind of thing. They have so many standards and all this tests and all this stuff that they have to negotiate on top of trying to be great teachers. I'm hoping in some ways that one of the opportunities that may come out of this pandemic is that it's really shaken up what we conceive of as the classroom space, right? What we conceive of as the workspace. And I think there's a huge opportunity there for us to think about how we might be a bit more generous in having different options for different folks and how they learn. It takes more work on the end, perhaps of the educator. But my experience with people that really love education is that they just want their kid to get there, right? They want the student to get there. So if they have to stretch and learn to make that possible, I think they will. So I wish I had the perfect answer. I can tell you that I'm trying really hard to get into a lot of public schools because teachers are hungry for this. They just have a lot against them. The groovy thing about creative problem solving is it can overlay any other module or something else they're teaching. It's kind of the salt and pepper to the menu, if you will. So we can get in and help them maintain the rules they have to follow, but they can still find some freedom within it.
That's good to know because my younger daughter is just entering her teaching profession and she's going to be teaching younger kids. So this would be great for her to know. Thank you.
Yeah. We do provide a creative problem solving for teachers as well. So and a regular CPS class will give you some skills as well. But yeah, check out our website. I'd love to be helpful. I'll just add, a lot of times when people talk about creativity, they talk about thinking outside the box. The truth is we're mostly creative inside the box because we all live inside of boxes. We all have so many restrictions and boundaries. Most of our great creativity happens within restriction, not with boundlessness. So there's hope there.
We have a question in the chat from Mike Zara, which is, how might cultivating a personal creative practice, such as weekly freeform dance or regular design thinking, improve one's mental or physical health? Are there any potential effects on idea generation, neuroplasticity, or body coordination?
Peter, why don't you take that? What are your thoughts?
Well, yes to the second part of that answer. I mean, I don't know, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think use it or lose it is a mantra that might be helpful here. I mean, to go back, and I don't mean to be totally flip, but if we think about how many hours of a day we sit in the way that we're currently oriented right now, in front of a screen, a frontally oriented relationship to space, probably sitting. And who knows what's happening with the spine and other things. And if we're not, if you calculate how many hours a day or a week or a month or a year you're doing, or a lifetime you're doing that, and not exploring the full three-dimensionality of your instrument and the world that you live in, you're missing an opportunity to be enhancing your awareness, becoming more articulate, and maximizing the benefit of the relationship between physicality and all of our cognitive functioning. So, and it doesn't necessarily take, you don't have to have any aspirations beyond just being curious and wanting to discover something, notice something about what's going on and what you might be in relationship to. You know, it could be, I don't know, sometimes I like to try to remind myself, because you know, I talk all this talk about dance this, dance that, but you know, every now and then, if I'm frustrated and waiting in line somewhere, if I have the presence of mind to remind myself, oh, I could just practice walking really slowly. Like there's an opportunity to sort of capitalize on the situation rather than just feel, you know, incapacitated by it. So absolutely, you know, it can take five minutes, roll around on the floor, put your feet in the air, lift your arms overhead, you know, hang upside down. I mean, when was the last time you hung upside down and felt the weight of your skull? You know, all these things, just think of the body as something to be experimented with, and that you have agency over right now. You don't have to be studying anything in particular. Go for
I'll
it.
just add really quickly on this point. I think there's a tremendous, I don't think, I know there's a tremendous amount of psychological and neuroscience research on the benefits of quote unquote meditation. And I think we often think about meditation as, you know, you sit there with your eyes closed, but the meditation is really about training attention. I mean, that's really what it's designed to do. And I've been, you know, listening to some great meditation teachers on podcasts recently talk about all of the things that Peter just said, right? That you can practice training your attention when you're walking and when you're in the world, and that this division between the practice on your cushion and your real life that's also illusory, and that you need to break through that, because we can constantly be practicing you know, the attentional control and better attentional habits. And so yeah, there's a lot of and the benefits there, yes, in walking meditations, exactly.
May I?
Yes.
Thank you. So those are really good answers. And I have a related one that relates to what Beth had said about creativity within restrictions. March 2nd, I started with an accountability partner. She's Chinese and she wanted to tap every night. And I'm not exactly sure what it involves, but she's doing that. And I decided that I would meditate every day for 16 minutes. I set the timer. I sit on my block in the same place. And I also write 3 good things every day. Laura King's strategy of you give it a title, you say what happened, you say how it felt, and you how you felt and what caused it. And just before I came on this, some friend complimented me on my increased empathy. And I didn't do anything for that. I think just, frankly, a lot of times I have to make myself do it. And I don't want to look bad because I'm doing this with a friend. She's in Hoboken and she usually does it before me. This morning I did it first thing. I just was tired of always coming in second. But that restriction has worked out great.
Well, I think there's something there with attention and accountability and building habits, right? I've almost reached 1 full year of meditating every day, and I'm tracking that, you know, and that was very purposeful because I have a lot of responsibility. I have people counting on me. You know, the virus hit. I'm like, oh my God, is my org going to close? Is my team going to lose their jobs? Like, that was a lot. But I couldn't be the leader to get them through that unless I could be clear, right? So instead of worrying about all those things, like, I decided I'm going to take some time to just be still, right? And pay attention to where I'm at, because, you know, the better moments for me as a thinker and a leader are when things are clear, right? When I can take a deep breath, and there's something there about attention. It doesn't mean bad things aren't going to happen or stressors aren't going to happen, but there is a way that we can be present that invites our best selves and our clearest thinking. And I think there's something in that with creativity. I think there's something in that with movement and attention, when we kind of honor that we are physical creatures that get all this input, and inviting stillness or connection is critical for clarity.
Thank you. I love this. This was great.
Can I make a comment? I wanted to add on to what Peter was saying. I'm Gail, class of 75. I just heard on the NPR the other day, Terry Gross was interviewing Twyla Tharp, the dancer choreographer, and she was talking about how both Merce Cunningham and Martha Graham were very debilitated later in their life because they only did their kind of movements. And so Twyla had really made a point of always moving all of her, you know, faculties in ways that maybe her style of dancing, or actually she really kept doing lots and lots of different styles. But I think when she said when she was in her 70s, she started taking boxing and doing different things to use different parts of her body. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here. Mix it up.
Michael, you have a question. What makes your mind focus on one point instead of all the other possible points of attention?
Oh, that's such a good question. That is at the heart of what I'm interested in. I think there are a couple of different answers. So the sort of standard answer is that there are things in the environment that can automatically grab your attention if they're loud enough or bright enough or unexpected enough, right? That our attention is definitely can be drawn and co-opted to certain things. But the place I've been really interested recently is in how things that aren't actually physically salient still do that, right? This tendency to reach down and see, I need to check this, right? Do I have a new message or not, right? Or the sort of how we gravitate towards habitual actions, right? And so we're not just competing with these external stimuli, but also these habitual actions that we engage in all the time. And I think there's not really a simple answer. I mean, one of the things I think that meditation is great for is that what you're training really is the ability to notice that you have been distracted and to bring your mind back to where it needs to be. And so I think that is something that you can train, right? Like, I feel constantly scattered often in many different directions, unless I take very proactive steps, so my husband is fond of saying about me that when I go to work and I'm working in my lab, like, I turn off my notifications and I silence my phone and I put everything away because it's too hard to do anything otherwise, right? So I think other ways that we can make our minds focus on one point instead of being pulled is really to be aware of the things that get in our way or that draw our attention away from the thing that we want to be doing, And for certain moments in the day, put in some, I think as Doreen was saying too, put in some restrictions, because those can also be really powerful in helping us to maintain our focus and kind of knowing where we get drawn away. That was a very roundabout way to answer that question, but there's just so much there.
It's so fascinating, just on the heels of that, Michael, that I was in a Pilates class yesterday, and I think of myself as pretty attuned to my own body, and but this instructor just gave such a simple prompt, and we were on the floor, and the feet are on the floor and knees are up, and I'm just lying on my back, and we're supposed to lift our pelvis off the floor and then just lower the spine and the pelvis gradually in sequence. But rather than just do it straight through the midline, she said, well, draw just a tiny little figure 8 with your pelvis laterally as you do that descent from one vertebra to the next. And it awoke such a new sensation for me of what she later described as, these important tiny little muscles whose job it is to create stability in the spine. It just allowed for the larger global muscles to sort of not have to do as much work, and allow for a little bit of stretching and remobilizing of these other areas. And it was such a subtle thing, but it was like my mind, not only my mind, my whole system, just the attention was focused on this completely new sensation that ultimately yielded a greater sense of flexibility and ease. And so it's really fascinating to hear and to contemplate, I don't know how small of a moment or a small of a bit of stimulus could be the trigger that really changes something much more profound. And we don't even, I don't know. I could go on, but it's.
There's 100% chance I'm going to try that after this call, because it just made my back feel better just hearing about that. I just want to try that.
Right?
Yeah. And I suck at Pilates, but I'm totally going to give that a go.
And I want to know where the Pilates class is.
Well, judgment is such a brutal force when it comes to the body, right? Even the way that we have trained ourselves to beat ourselves up for not being able to do this or not being able to do that or not looking this way or that way. And I think we really underestimate how that carries a legacy for us, sometimes for years. That's really takes a long time to unpack and gets in the way of our ability to actually have a more refined awareness. And go ahead.
I know, I was just going to say, it's interesting. We also haven't touched at all really on sometimes what can be the negative side of attention, right? How we can prioritize the negative aspects of certain things, and we can over focus on the negative, and or the example I always give, it's like the one bad comment in the student evaluations is the one that I can't forget about, right? And it's the only thing I can think of, even though there were 10 beautiful ones.
Yeah, what's the explanation for that?
Losses loom larger than gains, I think, is the behavioral economics way to think about that. Yeah, the sort of two equal things, right? The bad one seems to feel larger and takes up more of our mental space, and we give it more time when sometimes we don't need to.
Right. That makes me think of what are the contributing factors in an environment that seem inadvertently to reinforce, negative possibilities. I mean, I think Beth, you were alluding to this earlier, it made me think of architecture, like when we're in a room, or when you, and the elements that sort of define where and how you're supposed to sit. Or sometimes in the big dance studio, it's like I can feel some actually shifting back to teaching in person recently, after almost an entire year of trying to teach dance this way, where actually we were able to get some really, there was a level of freedom that by Zoom we were able to achieve. And then in some cases, I noticed that now that many of us are back in the big studio, some of these behavioral patterns of feeling exposed, feeling like, oh, this space means I'm supposed to act a certain way or look a certain way, like all of the elements that make us unconsciously affiliate certain kinds of behaviors with whether it's being asked of us or not. It's just such a complex thing that's hard to unpack.
I wanted to get, Michael, to something you said, and I see that Fred has a question in the chat as well, so I'll definitely get to that. But in thinking about, this is something I've worked a lot at, because I had a really hard time getting promoted to be an executive director. And I realized like I thought I was fabulous and I couldn't understand why no one else could see it. And I realized I was the only common denominator. So like I really had to look at that. And one of the things I realized about myself is when I would get certain critical comments or something that I had a real visceral reaction to, 9 times out of 10, there was something I was supposed to learn there, or something that I was resisting. And that's tough. Like as a first generation student, as a blue collar kid, I was like popping my blue collar all the time. I'm ready to fight. And so it's hard not to feel on the defensive a lot, and always kind of trying to like prove myself. So to get a critique could be deeply painful. But I find now that when I have a really strong and righteous reaction to something that someone might say to me, I mean, they could be full of it, but there's generally some nugget in there that I need to work on, what is that thing? And so kind of seeing what the gift is in the thing that provoked that really strong reaction to me, that overreaction in a way, or that wounded feeling. Like if somebody poked a bruise, and like, why do I have a bruise there? Right. And so that has always been, that's been part of my journey now as a leader, really thinking about when I have a disproportionate reaction, or I don't want to say overly sensitive, because that's really fraught for women, but when you have that, what is that teaching me about myself, or what can I look at there that will make me stronger? And Fred, I don't want to ignore your question. I see that you have a question about creative problem solving and Christianity and the Holy Spirit. I think that one of the lovely things about creative problem solving is, particularly in that generative stage, there's a vastness to it, right? A limitless to it, and a permission to kind of stretch and reach. I think a lot about my work when I was at Trinity and looking at archetypes and the gods and goddesses. And, we have these symbols for human experience and emotion that are too difficult to contain with our words, right? So we create, we have mythologies, and we have a sense of something greater than ourselves. And I think in that, it allows us to kind of touch grace and vastness, and contain it in a way so that we can benefit from it without being overwhelmed by it. So I think creativity definitely does help create a vehicle for that, whatever you believe. It helps you get close to your own greatness and vastness without feeling consumed or overwhelmed by it, so that you can do whatever piece of that you need to do. Makes it manageable.
Peter, there's a question for you.
All right. Is there a dance from Steve? Is there a dance exercise or drill that we can do to get that sense of our body that we might not ordinarily think or sense of during each day? Oh, wow. That's fun. Thanks for that great question. I mean, one of the first things that come to mind, and I'll do this sometimes in any number of my classes at some point, is, if you're just walking around the room, I might prompt you to use your feet in ways that you don't normally use them, like make your way across the room using your feet in 3 or 4 different ways. Like, how are you, and that gets at the question of how are you transferring your weight through what part of your feet, with what kind of speed, with what kind of energy, in what direction. You know, are you up high? Are you down low? Are you jumping? Are you, and just that can be an example for any number of, replace the feet with any other body part and just experiment with using it in maybe what we might think of as an unconventional way, or give yourself the task to work within some limitations, because as Beth was saying, sometimes that complete openness can be paralyzing. You could say, walking only in straight lines through space, change level 3 times. Or so you give yourself just really simple parameters, and then you allow the body to kind of teach you other possibilities, rather than trying to plan it out and plot it out ahead of time, which is just a different thing. It's not inherently a bad thing, it's just a different thing. So that would be one thing. And then I guess, just breathing. Take a moment, slow down, and notice what you notice about movement because of your breathing function. It's moving in 3 dimensions, front to back, up to down, side to side. The duration of breathing. How does the completion of the in-breath relate to the beginning of the out-breath? Can you have a playful relationship to that? What does that invite in terms of awareness? I could go on, but I hope that helps, Steve.
Anyone else? It's actually interesting you all keep talking about, so the thing that keeps coming into my brain is that when we talk about use it or lose it, especially around aging, one of the things we tell people is novelty, right? That's a good way to keep your brain active as you get older. And so some of the examples people give are not unlike what you just said, Peter, or some of the things that Michael and Beth have said earlier, like brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand, try to write something with your foot, these kinds of things that just learn a different language, learn a different card game. So it's interesting, our brains sort of crave that kind of novelty to keep its plasticity going.
Yeah, well, and just, I really think that relates. The body is the thing that we're living in from cradle to grave, and we are also in relationship to any number of other things. So that novelty can be explored. I love talking about how to use the body in more creative ways, but it also could be a spatial prompt. I'm thinking of what you were saying before, Michael, also about what did you say? Covert spatial attention. I don't know. Do we have a centralized notion of self in relationship to our environment, or could we have a decentralized notion of self? That is to say that we are not the center of everything. We are a functioning part of a much more complex thing, and an agent of change that is also changed by other things. And similarly, the body can be thought of in a decentralized way. Like the ear can be my center for a moment, or the belly button or the tailbone. And lending all of your attention to those things allows for a more plastic notion of self that I think must invite a kind of, it feels good to do, I think, and it also, I believe that it must have benefit for us long term, especially in bodies that feel like they're not quite as live as they once were.
So
No,
I'm mindful of the
improv
time.
game for that.
What's that, Beth?
I know a really good improv game for that. It's very fun. You can do it with a big group of people. It's called The Machine. It's very fun.
Fabulous.
We'll come to Trinity. We'll do it sometime.
Please do, yeah.
So I'm mindful of the time. It's about 5:09. Did anyone else have any questions, or did any of the panelists have anything they want to leave us with?
I will just encourage people to do what I ask my students in my seminar to do for 8 weeks, which is to pay attention to what you pay attention to
Mhm.
and track it and log it and learn your attentional habits because they can be informative.
Absolutely, I concur. And ask you and notice how much of that is body focused attention as opposed to a different kind of it. Or I mean, not that I don't even know if we can call it a different kind of attention. It's still in the body. It's still, like a colleague of mine likes to say, the brain is just another body part.
I would invite everyone to be curious. This is something I've gotten very curious about curiosity. Just thinking about how children have this way of approaching the world with this sense of curiosity, and there's an incredible amount of confidence in that, and a kind of a distance from it when you don't have to know everything. Or have all the answers or be in control of everything. If you allow yourself just to be truly curious and in a curious moment, there's incredible freedom and confidence in that. So I've been thinking a lot about inviting more curiosity into every part of my life.
Well, I'll just say thank you again to Sarah for organizing this. It's been
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. What a rich experience. I'm so grateful.
Thank you all. This was fabulous. 1,000 times more than I was expecting. I really impressed with all three of you. Really incredible. All right, so maybe we just do a virtual applause. I'm feeling guilty that I didn't give them the full intros they deserve because they really are quite impressive people, all of them, but thank you.
Yay. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Posted, I put the link. It'll be on the Trinity College Neuroscience YouTube channel.
Oh, fabulous. Great. Thank you.
All right.
Have a good night, all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care, everybody.